Well, thank you, Bambi. I think we'll go ahead and get started because we have so much to cover here, and we'll allow folks to join us as we get started. But we would like to begin this meeting by acknowledging that we are all on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We do the land acknowledgement to acknowledge the first peoples of this land and honor their resiliency as they continue to steward these lands. With that, welcome everyone to the Building Performance Standards Policy Recommendations Land at Large. I'll give you a quick overview of the agenda here, and then we'll proceed to talk a little bit about this work, where it came from, and where we're going from here. But you will, of course, hear from me giving you that overview on the project, and then we will move right on to Steve Gelb at Emerald Cities Collaborative to talk about the draft policy recommendations that have come out of the work that the Building Performance Task Force has been doing within HDC over the last few months. And then we'll hear from Alistair Jackson from O'Brien 360, who's going to provide us with an update on the audits that we have been doing as part of this project to really share what we have learned so far. And then I'll come back for a Q&A session, because we do want to make this more conversation focused and really hear from all of you as we proceed and move forward. Next slide, please. So this work began at the end of last year, and this was following an executive order that was issued by former Mayor Mayor Durkan, who was directing the Seattle Office of Sustainability to implement a new carbon-based building performance standards policy for buildings that are over 20,000 square feet. We recognized, and the Mayor's office also recognized, that this, of course, is a great opportunity to move towards net zero carbon building portfolios, but also realize that this may have impact on subsidized multifamily affordable housing buildings. And therefore, we convened to really be sure that the policy process is informed by feedback, input, and the experience of affordable housing providers in co-creating solutions as we move forward towards a policy being drafted. And as a part of that work, we also began research around what are the key considerations that need to be made in buildings for different building typologies. And we combined about 15 HDC member properties for a full audit that has been conducted so far by O'Brien 360, and you'll be hearing some key takeaways on that in just a few. Next slide, please. So as we proceed from here, we're getting closer to the conclusion on this project. We began in November of last year by launching the Building Performance Standards Task Force of HDC, which is made up of many of you who are joining us here, and some others were not able to join us. And OSE has been a partner participating at that table. We've also convened some asset managers to be sure that we're really comprehensively getting input around how buildings are maintained and how the financing can consider some of these policy changes, and we can also be cognizant of some of the financing needs as we are moving forward policy recommendations. And then following today, there will be an open house. OSE has been hosting open houses and doing extensive outreach to different stakeholders to really get feedback and input to inform their policies. So on June 16th, they will have another open house, which is an opportunity for folks to continue to engage. By June 24th, we expect, fingers crossed, that the audits would be completed then, and we will have enough data to inform our final recommendations that will be submitted to OSE by June 30th. By July 1st, we expect that a draft of policy recommendations will be submitted to the mayor by our partners at OSE moving forward. And then we do anticipate that this year, a full policy package will be moved forward, getting closer to being submitted to council from the mayor's office. And in 2023, we expect that a rulemaking process will be proceeding and moving forward, and there will be program development and implementation by the timelines of 2024 towards 2026 as the compliance periods begin. So with that, I do want to highlight some key areas that we have really germanely focused on in talking about policy recommendations for the building performance standards policy. We've highlighted that there's extensive need for technical assistance and setting standards that are simple and clear and more prescriptive for a lot of our affordable housing providers. So we have details around what those strategies are that we see to be essential for consideration. We've also talked extensively about the need for funding, the need for grants, the need for multi-layered funding and financing to really support affordable housing providers in being able to implement these policies. And Steve will walk you through some of the detailed considerations on that front. We also recognize that some of these buildings were built in a different timeline, and they may not be able to be compliant to some of the standards that we will set. So we've looked at exemptions and alternative compliance pathways that can be moved forward to really ensure that we're still moving towards a net zero carbon building, but we're also being considerate of areas where exemptions will be necessary. And then we've talked about some of the policies and metrics, looking at other cities like Denver, who are doing a lot of this work and really wanting to learn from them how to implement some of their policies and metrics that they've been using that are more defined and prescriptive and get us to a place where we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And with that overview, I will hand over to Steve, who will walk you through the policy recommendations in more details, and we'll invite that all of you ask questions, pass your comments in the chat box. Let this really be a conversation as a sector, not that the task force has set this in stone. We're really looking to get feedback from all of you. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Patience. Couple of things. One thing before I forget, if we have time at the end, there are a few opportunities to get ahead of this work for you all as housing providers and contractors. So if we have time, we may want to touch on those. I just want to mention that. I'm going to share my screen so I'm going to walk you through a little mural. Can everyone see my screen now? Okay. Yes, great. And if we have, as we get input, we may do a voting session. We'll see if we need to do that, but let me walk through them first. As Patience mentioned, I'm going to go over 3 key areas that in our listening so far and in our task force, we identified as critical. And the first is technical assistance. These are all areas where we've identified needs for technical assistance. And that could be from the city or from third-party provider provided by the city, or a roster of third-party providers that the city could share with you all. So the first here is energy audits and electrification assessments, just looking at your buildings and understanding what needs to be done to make them more efficient to comply with state or city policy in terms of energy use and or electrification. And then modeling to sort of figure out how to get there and what can be done and what it might cost to do those things. Access to different funding sources. So we're navigating the resources that are available in the weatherization program, which is currently HomeWise under the Office of Housing, but also utility programs and other potential funding resources. Help with project or construction management. So how to phase these projects in over time, potentially how to deal with doing work while residents are present, or how to manage them if they're not, etc. Really access to professionals who can help with capital needs assessments. We recognize that capital needs assessments likely will need to encompass some of the requirements of a building performance standard to lay out the pathway for more energy efficiency and electrification of systems. So the ability to integrate those together and make sure that the professionals that are doing capital needs assessments have those tools or can partner with those who do. Assistance with understanding other environmental related issues that may come in as asbestos and lead and so on, that could be impacted when we're talking about removing old systems or altering parts of your buildings. And finally, managing kind of historic preservation and landmark regulations. So our, typically we sort of avoid those and try to get around them. But some of the requirements in these rules could push you toward having to deal with them, and how do you deal with them, and what complies and what doesn't, and what kind of assistance could be available to assist with that. So let me stop after this section and ask if there are questions. And I will also look at the chat and see. I don't see any questions in the chat. Anyone have questions before we move on to the next section? Hearing nothing, try the next section. So next section is funding and financing. And I just want to emphasize here is, so funding, we're generally talking about grants. So where do you all need direct assistance or would benefit from direct assistance, and financing, obviously, how can you pay for it over time? So this first one is kind of a little bit of repetition of the earlier technical assistance, although the idea here was, is there a one-stop shop where you can essentially kind of apply once or submit paperwork once and get access to all of the funds? So not just advice on how to find all these different fund sources, but actually pulling them all together into one program, if you will. Special grants for remediation of some of the environmental hazards that may be detected. What we're trying to do here is to identify issues that may be really unique to certain buildings and create kind of an exceptional burden. So what are those, how do we get around those, and what kind of funding might be needed to do that? Financial support for audits and electrification. These are investments up front that happen before you need to do the work, before you see any of the benefit, and so on. And are those a burden, and do we need financial support for that? Loan programs that align with other affordable housing finance, and this has always been a challenge. But these, a lot of these improvements, some of them will pay for themselves over time, some may not. So we may need new tools to help finance them and spread the cost over time. Grants for electrical infrastructure and capacity upgrades. So again, some of the unique aspects we've identified in buildings is some buildings will be fairly well suited to fully electrify because they either are all electric or were mostly electric or have lots of capacity. Some will be in a very in a very difficult position to do that. So potentially direct grants toward those that are in the most difficult position to do that, and focus on the electrical infrastructure to enable electrification, and not on the appliances or systems themselves. Financial support for the project planning, capital needs assessment work. As I mentioned, capital needs assessments will probably be more involved and need extra expertise and cost more money. Who's going to pay for that? Can funding be available for that? And, finally, some of these upgrades may trigger substantial alteration, or be substantial alteration, which triggers building codes and other requirements that are outside of this sort of BPS requirement. And if that is the case, where does that funding come from, and can there be assistance for that? So I will stop here. I see one question in the chat. So Mindy's question, I think, was kind of to that first technical section. And honestly, I don't know if we have a full answer to this. I think part of the question is, what would you all want? I think, I guess my view would be, the more the city is willing to do to make it easier for you all to comply, which it would be to have a roster of providers, make sure they're of high quality, have their pricing being clear and upfront, clear and upfront. So you're spending less time having to negotiate with many providers in many different areas to get this work done. Does that answer your question, Mindy, or do you want to follow up?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I just, of the options you gave, it seemed like there was one whereby the city would take on some of that assistance directly, whereas this option would be more onus on each provider, and doing the contracting rather than the city, it sounded like. So just trying to understand the range of proposal.
Yeah, I think you raised a good question. And I want to emphasize, these are fairly vague still. So these are, we give the city some options here. If you feel strongly that we shouldn't and should say, we want city auditors available, or we want, the city to assure the quality of the people on their roster, or what to pay them, whatever. Please help us with that, because we believe there will be, this is kind of like a big wish list, right? And we haven't received a response from the Office of Sustainability yet to how they feel about all of these. They're listening at this point, but at some point they're going to have to go through them and say, what can we really deliver, and what do we want to ask for? Yeah. And then the next question is around federal financing. Okay, I don't have a great answer to that. I think that's something we put into the recommendations as more details, if that works for folks. Patience, or Alistair, or Ellie, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think if we don't have a question, an answer for it right now, it would be a great question to ask the city.
Yeah, I think it's something to add to the list, because I think what we're trying to do is anticipate sort of consequences of these policies that are unintended but are real for you all in terms of cost and complexity. And this would be an example, right? If we bring in federal funding, that's great, but it triggers other things. So I thank you for raising this.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
So the last area is alternative compliance. And I just want to clarify a little bit of something Patience said. This could be around buildings that have trouble complying, but it could also be an option for all buildings. And the first one is probably the clearest example of that is, traditionally a building performance standard either sets an emissions standard of what the building needs to emit over time, decreasing over time, or an energy use metric over time. One of the alternatives would be a prescriptive path. So would allow, perhaps in affordable housing specifically, to say, if you have changed your heating system from X to Y and your hot water system, and you've installed these 3 other measures in your building, then you're considered in compliance. Even if perhaps your emissions don't meet the compliance guidelines, or your energy doesn't, but you've done sort of what's reasonable or what is expected. And the advantages of this is that it's simpler to deal with, potentially. It doesn't require as much engineering or assessment. The disadvantage is you may not get the same performance out of it, and it doesn't allow for sort of creative solutions where you may be able to reduce your emissions or energy use a lot more in one area and less in another, but it prescribes what you should do. So this is one alternative compliance path. Another one is to not do excessively costly upgrades. So we know some buildings will require more electric capacity. We've heard of cases where an electric vault isn't big enough and it requires major construction in the building. So should those be exempt? This is a case of an exemption, exempt from the policy, where you will maybe need to reach a lower goal or a lower barrier. Historic buildings, perhaps the historic building rules themselves don't allow for you to meet the requirements of the policy. And then we had an option to delay, to allow coordination with tax credit financing. So if you're going to refinance with tax credits and do a major remodel, that to hold off any of the upgrades until you do all that, to be more practical, but also allow you to have the funds to do it. And is there a partial credit or credit for sort of best efforts? So you've done all of the cost effective to determine what that means, but all of the measures that reach a certain level of investment, and you haven't reached the standard, but it's considered best effort and you might be in compliance. And then the ability to look at some of the uniqueness of affordable housing being very small units compared to a lot of commercial multifamily, and have sort of exemptions. So to say energy use may be somewhat higher because you're dealing with studio units that are continue to use electric resistance heat versus heat pumps, and the standard is adjusted in some way, similar to the way code allows you to use electric resistance heat in small units. So I'm going to stop there, and I see one question from Ellie. Can you, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, Ellie. Maybe you can explain it and ask, maybe someone else can help with that too.
Yeah, I think some of the Commerce Energy Program grants require the projects to actually meet with their targeted EUI, I think by 2030. And if the project apply for alternative compliance path with City of Seattle, that just mean that they would not be able to apply for the Commerce grant.
Yep. So I think you're referring to the early adopter grants at the Department of Commerce. So just to let everyone know, so we have a state building performance standard. It does not apply to multifamily housing right now, but the early adopter grants are available to multifamily housing. So I think you are correct. I know you're correct in that they do require an EUI standard to get that funding. First I want to emphasize what we're going over today are just recommendations to the city to consider in their policy. So we don't know if there will be an alternative path for prescriptive compliance. If there is, I think this raises the issue. It could disqualify you from other types of funding potentially, if the state had funding, for example, through an EUI calculation. So I think that's a good flag for us. Other questions? Okay. So I think I will stop there and turn it over to Alistair.
Thanks, Steve. I will now share. And just give you a quick update. I'm assuming you can see my screen now rather than Steve's. Just to give you a quick update on where things stand with the building audits we've been doing. As Patience outlined earlier on, we're planning to get this audit process completed this month. We're a little behind where we'd hoped to be, but in terms of feeding information into the BPS process, I think the timing is still pretty good. There's some informing of the recommendations that Steve's been kind of walking through already. And more particularly, I think, as we're able to tease out more information from the findings from the audits and some follow-up analysis, it'll help inform the rule-making phase of the BPS policy. So overall, the timing's pretty good. This is the list of buildings. We're in pretty good shape in terms of completing audits. We had started off with 15 buildings in total. I think there are actually 14 listed here. One of them we have dropped because of timing issues. Of the 14, we have 10 audits completed. Catholic Housing Services so far has been unresponsive, and we will continue to push with them because there are a couple of buildings that we would really like to get into and complete the audit on because they're good typologies for what we think are going to be important buildings to be able to explore. Essentially, the selection for these buildings was originally based on building EUI. So we were looking at data from the benchmarking information for the city, identifying buildings of different age, different size, different fuel uses, both gas and electric or all electric, whether they were gas for domestic hot water or electric for domestic hot water versus for space heat and so on. And then really looking at what the building's energy use intensity was, because at that time we were thinking that we were going to be using an EUI target as the basis for the BPS. The BPS is now clearly policy-wise moving towards an emissions-based target. So what we need to do is translate in the emissions, calculate the greenhouse gas emissions intensity, and we have all the data to do that. We just haven't actually completed that part of the process. But that will be interesting and useful information. One of the things that we'll be looking at there is not just the greenhouse gas emissions intensity per square foot, but also per occupant or per bedroom. One of the things that's becoming clear in the conversation with the building performance standard team is that some need to recognize the difference in occupant density when thinking about what the targets and thresholds should be, is one of the things that we're definitely kind of conscious of, and so we'll be working through that. Just to visit again overall, the scope of work as far as these building audits is concerned has been to focus on really understanding the type, age, performance of heating, cooling, ventilation, and hot water systems, thinking about fuel type, what the capacity of the system is, what its service life is. Obviously, those are all key factors when it comes to start thinking about retrofit and replacement, and thinking about Steve's mention of the delay in timing, not just to think about coordination with a refinance, but also to kind of be consistent with replacement cycles where possible. So all of those things are relevant. One of the big ones, thinking about barriers to electrification. So the infrastructure, the electrical capacity in the building is obviously a big one, but also physical barriers. Switching from gas boilers to electric heat pump plant is going to involve typically more space requirements, potentially a little more in terms of water storage capacity, hot water storage capacity, and so on. So are the physical locations where that additional plant can be installed in the building, and what are the implications of that? And to date, we're certainly typically seeing buildings where there are possibilities. General building envelope conditions. Obviously, there will be situations where embarking on a retrofit as part of compliance with this building performance standard may involve or create an opportunity for envelope upgrades. And so understanding what those conditions look like and thinking about what the implications, cost implications, and so are, and also what the performance gains might be. What's the current standard of the envelope? How significant would be the savings from upgrading it? And then thinking about other energy efficiency opportunities. A lot of the buildings we're looking at have had some form of weatherization upgrades in the near or mid-recent past. Are there still opportunities on the table for energy efficiency improvements from lighting retrofits, for example, or other opportunities? So those are the things we've been sort of focusing on to make sure that we have a really good picture of all of these buildings in terms of understanding what the influences and opportunities are. In terms of preliminary findings, we've already touched on some of these in Steve's section. Installed electric capacity and the infrastructure upstream of the building is one of the things that may well pose a challenge. One of the things we are finding is that in some of the buildings, it's difficult to really identify what the full capacity of the installed electrical system is, and almost impossible to understand how much of that capacity is currently being utilized. An electrical system is always designed with some load factors. In simple terms, if you have a 200 amp panel service in a home, you're going to have more than 200 amps of potential load running through that panel, but the expectation is that you never have all of that load running simultaneously, so you never exceed the capacity of the panel, and the same thing happens at the scale of a multifamily building. So one of the things we've now stepped forward to with Seattle City Light is to actually get releases from all the building owners and understand what the peak demand is from the building. So over the year, what is the highest peak demand that Seattle City Light has seen from those buildings? And that's going to give us another data point to understand, how much electricity at the worst case moment is being consumed by the building, and therefore how much headspace is there between that load and the installed capacity. So we're kind of peeling away more layers of the onion there. We're also recognizing that in some cases there might be an additional step to do a load study and actually look at how the loads are being used in the building. So that might be a second effort if we can find funding to dig into that in more detail, if indeed it seems that the city lighted information is not sufficient. We're generally finding that fossil fuel consumption in buildings is localized to a small number of large pieces of equipment. So that generally is considered a good thing, right? It's not as if we've got a lot of distributed pieces of equipment that need retrofitting. And that we've seen pretty consistently. We are seeing that some buildings do have significant opportunities for savings and from envelope-based savings, so envelope upgrades that could significantly improve the energy efficiency from a heating perspective. Something we've seen pretty typically, that there are still opportunities for lighting upgrades that would both reduce load on the electric system and also reduce energy consumption and potentially associated emissions. There is this other conversation now about if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions and you're in an all-electric building and Seattle City Light essentially has zero carbon emissions from their electricity, where does that fit in the mix in terms of understanding what the need for retrofit is if the building is essentially zero carbon? And that comes down to efficiency, load on the grid, and all of those things. Steve already mentioned this issue about triggering substantial alteration requirements. And this is definitely a significant issue because there is a kind of cascading effect. Once you are determined to be performing a substantial alteration, it could significantly escalate the impacts on the building and therefore on cost. And so understanding and, from a policy recommendation point of view, I think pushing on the city to make sure that for affordable housing, there is maybe some special consideration given for how that substantial alteration determination is made. There is clearly language in the code that allows for some discretion at the jurisdiction. And so this might be a situation where we can leverage that to some extent and make sure that there's a consistent approach and perhaps a slightly more lenient approach. But that's all just coming from my perspective, not from the city. We haven't really opened discussions on that topic yet. That pretty much is what I have. Does anybody have any questions? I'll jump back to the Zoom chat.
Alistair, I had a question.
Yeah.
One of the hopes was we have some idea of cost for a lot of the complexities you've identified. Do you have any progress on those fronts and to what kind of magnitude we're talking about with some of these different challenges that could exist in some buildings?
Not enough to speak to it yet. I think that's a significant part of what's ahead of us. To the extent we can drill down on that this month, we will. But I think that, quite honestly, it's going to take a little more time to tease that out in more detail. I think we will have some rough order of magnitude estimates for some of the things that we're seeing in these particular buildings. But we'll continue to refine that as time goes on. And the other thing to be conscious of is that a lot of the technologies that we're talking about here are, until recently, seen as atypical and unusual in the market. They're now becoming more accepted. And I think even in the affordable housing space, the comfort level with heat pump water heaters, for example, has increased. The cost of these kind of retrofits or for equipment installations in new construction is dropping really rapidly at the moment. So I think that's, something else that we'll want to watch that trajectory. We do have one project that had a heat pump water heater retrofit done a few years ago, one of the bellwether projects. And so that's interesting, lessons to be learned from that, because there's a, there's a data point there in terms of what that cost was and what the savings has been. And so that's helpful. We have a couple of other buildings from Community Roots who have just undergone retrofits. And so we'll have hard numbers on what those costs were and what the implications of them have been. We'll just keep feeding more information in as we can.
Well, thank you, Ulster. I would just add on that costing point and question that's going to be really germane for our next steps as we think of the recommendations to the city, because we've talked extensively about the need for funding, the need for financing, but not with any specific sizing of what the cost is. So that's really going to be helpful in informing that work and giving a number to what we're advocating for on that front. So thank you for your work on that, and we'll be looking forward to getting an update from you and your team in the next few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that, we're shifting gears to an open Q&A to get any additional questions from all of you, to get feedback on any recommendations that you would like expanded, whether you have comments or questions. This is the opportunity to be able to do that. Nicole, I see you've unmuted. I don't know if you were intending to speak, but feel free to go ahead.
Thank you. I did have something to say. I didn't mean to unmute myself so early, but anyway, I'm here now. So Sandra sends her regrets. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency that she needed to attend to this week, so we'll be out for a bit. The only thing I wanted to just comment on was at the very beginning, you presented the timeline, which was noting the legislation to the mayor on July 1st. Actually, it will be a little bit later than that in July. We're getting confirmation on exact dates now, but we do have a little more wiggle room there. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe more towards August, but in any case, timeline is great for this work, and just wanted to share also my thanks and the city's thanks for all the work going into preparing these recommendations.
Patience, I was just wondering, while Nicole has the floor, if she might introduce the accelerator. Would that be appropriate, Nicole, just to tell the folks here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So we did have an initial tranche of funding this year for $220K, and we have contracted with a team that's led by Stillwater Energy. They also have folks from Ecotope and Energy 350 on board. And essentially what we're kicking off this year is a technical support program, education outreach, mainly to start with some of the larger commercial folks who are on the hook to comply with the state building performance standard by 2026, but really narrowing in on like those nonprofits, underserved buildings that might be in communities that have a high race and social equity index. But then also this year, kicking off a planning process, say, okay, we really need to make sure that we also include multifamily and smaller commercial in this, obviously for everything that this organization is pointing out as needs. So really growing that model, and we'll be kicking it off soon. So kind of learning from our initial contacts this year and floating a little bit into 2023, but the intent is to really make this a much bigger, more inclusive program.
And I will share that recommendations from the Green New Deal Oversight Board were to increase the budget substantially, focused on under-resourced buildings, which would include affordable housing, hopefully.
Thanks for including that, Steve. I'm not sure exactly when I can share that. So.
Do we have a sense of the size of the budget so far that would cover some of this?
Yeah, so far, just this year was about 220, and then we definitely have that ongoing, but what the budget Green New Deal Oversight Board has recommended, I think it's 4.5 Is that correct, Steve? And
Yes.
I want to, thank you for your work with the oversight board towards making that recommendation. So,
Absolutely. Thank you.
yeah, really are really see a need to expand this and have been looking for that. And also that obviously you'll be looking to leverage other federal funding too as that becomes available. And noting that sometimes I think Ellie pointed out that sometimes that can come with some extra requirements. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Nicole, for that update. Any other comment from folks on the recommendations? And I'll go ahead and pull them up here so folks can see them summarized in the different buckets that Steve was able to walk folks through. So we're looking at technical assistance and looking at that roster of qualified party providers. And I really appreciated, Mindy, your point asking the question of if the city is going to define the scope of fees, if this is a city provided service. That's really something that we still need to think further into in terms of what this looks like. I think the recommendation has gone further as identifying need, but we've not gotten into the details of what an operation of this would look like. Okay. I often take the silence to say this has been really great work that the task force has done. Becky, I see you have your hand up before I conclude here. Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? So I said, kind of tagging on Ellie's question, I think that I said in a NAIOP meeting about the state standards, and it just feels like they're rolling out their policy at this very similar timeline with projected compliance 2027, and then some funding available starting 2025. Some recommendations around like the early benchmarking energy management planning this fall. So I think it just a big question for the Seattle operators would be if you're in Seattle, if you're an eligible building in Seattle, are you then exempt from having to do anything with the state? Is that expected, Nicole, or are you expected to have to comply with both programs? You're on mute.
Sorry, your sound got a little funny there, so I might have missed like one or two words.
Sorry.
So yeah, with the state, we're, at this point, the Seattle folks have to comply with whatever state requirements because we all have to, our city buildings have to, we can't, get them to really change that. But what we're looking at for timeline for multifamily in terms of our Seattle performance standards is that nothing would be required until at least after 2030 because the state there's so many unknowns with that right now. They'll have the benchmarking requirement. All Seattle buildings and affordable housing has been great about already reporting. So you've kind of met that. The one thing we are looking that may be a city requirement in the 2026 to 2030 that would affect multifamily is a little more stringent benchmarking verification requirement to make sure that folks are setting the appropriate targets and there aren't errors in reporting. But in general, we're looking at, somebody pulled this up here, that for affordable multifamily, this might not even break it out. I think this is an older slide, that the first targets wouldn't actually be until 2036 time period. Market rate would start in 2031. And certainly it'd be voluntary opportunities. Maybe there's an opportunity for city focused early incentives.
No, Cole, correct me if I'm wrong. I think Alistair mentioned earlier, the city is moving toward an emissions standard. And part of that was to align with, but not conflict with state standards. So the state would be sort of be an energy use standard. The city would be an emission standard. Ideally, there will be some alignment and coordination. So you projects that comply with both at the same time. So I know
yeah, that is correct. We're looking at just an emissions standpoint to not duplicate what the state might be rolling out, because we don't know. They have the voluntary target for multifamily right now, but we don't know really what the required target will be until after they have their rulemaking process in 2030. So that could change. Likely should be some type of normalization factor. I would think that's in rulemaking. But yes, we would want to make sure that if a building meets no emissions, meets the Seattle emissions targets, but say still does not quite meet the state energy efficiency target. I think this is what you're getting at, is the concern. How do we rectify that? Is that kind of, in a nutshell, what we're really worried about?
Yeah, and their response, I'm like, hey, Seattle's rolling out a program also, and how are you managing projects that are in both jurisdictions? And they were, it was kind of a one-word response.
Oh, really? Because we've talked with them that we're aligning the timelines, and and that would be a significant factor where Seattle would be having that conversation during that rulemaking process, and obviously before that, as we communicate our standards. But I think that because that existing voluntary target maybe it's not quite appropriate, especially for dense multifamily. Yeah, it's on our minds. So.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nicole. We certainly appreciate the alignment because it helps simplify the process for housing providers. I think there was a question earlier about the early adopter incentive program, which since we're choosing not to go with this energy efficiency standard, that EUI requirement is actually part of the qualifications for the early adopter incentive. So things to be thinking of as we move recommendations forward. With that, I think we have come to the top tier end of this Linux lunch. I really appreciate all of you joining us at this time, raising critical questions, and we hope you will follow up with us and providing additional feedback as we continue to finalize these recommendations and prepare to submit them to OSE by end of this month, and anticipate legislation moves forward over the next few weeks and months. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.